In a revelation that stunned the world, Russia uncovered a massive oil reserve estimated at 50 billion barrels beneath a nation in Africa that few ever associated with fossil fuel wealth. The question on everyone's mind now is, what is Russia doing there? Which country is involved? And what could this mean for the African continent as a whole? Let's take a closer look. Located in the heart of the Sahel, where sun-scorched landscapes stretch into the horizon and the soil cracks beneath relentless heat, Burkina Faso was never imagined as an oil-rich territory. Its identity has long been tied to cotton production rather than crude oil. Stories of wealth from petroleum seemed far-fetched here. There were no bustling oil ports, no famed drilling operations, and no legacy of energy empires. However, in early 2025, this perception was shattered. Beneath decades of dust and neglect, a monumental discovery was made, an oil reserve so enormous that it rewrote the narrative of Burkina Faso overnight. It was hidden beneath the very terrain that multinational companies had written off for generations. Global energy giants such as ExxonMobil, Shell, and Total Energies had long overlooked Burkina Faso. Their focus remained on proven petroleum hubs like Nigeria, Algeria, and Angola. The West African nation was viewed as too dry, too politically unstable, and too remote to be of strategic value, especially since it lacked direct access to the sea, making transportation of oil extremely difficult and costly. As a result, exploration efforts were minimal. The perceived instability and lack of infrastructure discouraged investment. But unbeknownst to the world, a vast oil kingdom lay beneath the soil, untapped and ignored. The discovery didn't start in Burkina Faso, though. It began thousands of miles away in Moscow. Faced with increasing international sanctions, Russia pivoted its strategy toward expanding influence through non-military means. Rather than relying solely on force, the Kremlin adopted a subtler, long-term approach involving technology, engineering, and resource extraction. Africa became a prime target in this new geopolitical campaign, and energy was Russia's key instrument. Backed by government support and rich in political motivation, Gazprom, Russia's state-controlled energy giant, turned its attention to areas other companies had disregarded. Burkina Faso offered the perfect scenario for Russia's ambitions. Estranged from Western powers, resistant to International Monetary Fund, IMF, conditions, and led by a government actively seeking new alliances, the country welcomed Russia's involvement. Under the leadership of President Ibrahim Traore, the Burkinabe government viewed Russian collaboration not just as a tactical partnership, but as an opportunity to shape a new national identity. Beginning in 2023, Russian geologists and engineers from Gazprom commenced detailed exploration in northern Burkina Faso. Employing sophisticated seismic imaging and satellite-assisted surveys, they scanned landscapes once dismissed as barren. What others had overlooked, Gazprom detected: indications of rich hydrocarbon deposits buried beneath ancient geological formations. Their work was quiet and deliberate. There were no major announcements, no press coverage, just patient drilling and data analysis. Then, in the opening weeks of 2025, their findings were confirmed. The results revealed not just a marginal oil field, but a truly massive deposit minus 50 billion barrels of crude oil, enough to transform the country's economic fate. Even more impressive than the size of the reserve was the type of oil discovered. Analysts described it as light and sweet crude, highly valued in the global market for its ease of refinement into fuel and other petroleum products. This finding elevated the discovery from significant to extraordinary. What puzzled many, however, was how such a vast reserve ended up in a landlocked region with no prior oil history. According to geologists, the explanation may lie in ancient history. During the Paleozoic and Mesozoic periods, much of West Africa, including modern-day Burkina Faso, was submerged under a vast inland sea. This sea accumulated dense organic matter, buried in low oxygen environments, ideal conditions for oil formation. Over millions of years, sediment layered and sealed these hydrocarbons deep underground. Unlike other regions plagued by tectonic shifts or seismic activity, Burkina Faso's relative geological stability preserved the deposits, essentially locking them away in time. So why had this treasure remained undiscovered for so long? The truth is, very few had seriously investigated the possibility. The technological tools needed to detect these deep, subtle anomalies weren't available or deployed by earlier companies. Those who did attempt exploration relied on outdated data and faced daunting logistical challenges. For companies from the West, a landlocked nation like Burkina Faso was economically unappealing. Developing the infrastructure to extract and export the oil, pipelines, refineries, and road networks seemed like an insurmountable task. But Russia saw what others didn't. And now, the landscape of African energy politics may never be the same. For Gazprom, the challenges that might deter other companies were no obstacle. Backed by the strategic ambitions of the Russian state, this move into Burkina Faso was more than a business venture. It was a calculated geopolitical investment designed for the long haul. Now that the oil discovery has been verified and early-stage development and extraction plans are in motion, the potential consequences are enormous. At current market prices, this single oil reserve could generate an astonishing $3 trillion in long-term revenue. But unlike previous oil booms in Africa, this one isn't being managed by a coalition of Western oil conglomerates, nor is it overseen by international financial institutions like the IMF. Instead, it's being led by a sanctioned Eurasian power in direct collaboration with a military-led African government that has publicly rejected the legacies of colonial oversight and foreign-imposed governance. Together, they are laying the groundwork for an alternative model, one that challenges long-established norms of global energy control. In today's world, where access to energy translates into political influence and economic leverage, this discovery is more than just about oil. It signals a fundamental power shift, a new chapter in which Western dominance in African resource politics is rapidly diminishing. The ripple effects could lead to major realignments, both regionally and globally. And yet, for all the drama surrounding the announcement, the oil has not yet begun to flow. Burkina Faso's leadership, particularly under President Ibrahim Traore, has pledged that this newfound wealth will not become another case of stolen dreams or external exploitation. Officials insist that this oil will be used to uplift the nation, building infrastructure, cities, and public services, rather than just enriching elites or foreign investors. But history cautions us. Promises of transformation through oil wealth have echoed before, in Venezuela, Angola, Iraq, only to end in corruption, inequality, and turmoil. The question, then, isn't just about the presence of oil underground. The real issue is who will control it and how its benefits will be distributed. When the discovery of 50 billion barrels of oil in Burkina Faso made headlines, Western diplomats didn't doubt its authenticity. Instead, their immediate concern was about management and control. Who would dictate the terms of production, investment, and profit sharing? And that answer didn't come through formal press briefings or multilateral agreements. It emerged from the shifting political winds of the Sahel. France, once the dominant external player in Burkina Faso, has seen its influence collapse. In its place, Russia has stepped in. To grasp the full meaning of this shift, you must look beyond the oil fields and into the evolving centers of political power. This is not simply a matter of resource ownership. It's about trust, alliances, and who is allowed to protect and profit from those resources. Historically, Burkina Faso was one of France's most dependable francophone allies in West Africa. French troops were stationed on its soil. French businesses dominated sectors like banking and communications, and Paris enjoyed direct access to the country's political elite. It was a textbook example of the so-called Franafrique system, deep-rooted, complex, and seemingly immovable. But discontent was brewing beneath the surface. Many Burkinabe began to see France's involvement not as support, but as interference. Military operations, first under Operation Serval and later Operation Barkhane, failed to curb the rise of extremist violence. Public frustration grew as terrorist attacks worsened and French-led strategies yielded few results. At the same time, accusations of corruption and dependency mounted. Western aid was increasingly viewed as conditional and self-serving, often nudging the country in directions that aligned more with French interests than with the Burkinabe people's needs. Then came 2022, when a young army captain named Ibrahim Traore led a coup that overthrew the civilian government. This wasn't merely a political shakeup, it marked a decisive rejection of the Western political and economic order. It was a loud and clear message that Burkina Faso was ready to forge a new path. Yet, Traore didn't isolate his country. He pivoted, quickly and purposefully, toward new allies. In the months following the coup, a clear pattern emerged. Russian influence grew not through official embassies or grand state visits, but through more discreet means: private security partnerships, military consultants, and informal diplomatic envoys. Russia proved adept at navigating the situation. They didn't come bearing colonial baggage, and they offered what Burkina Faso's new leadership craved: support without condescension. The relationship evolved quietly but rapidly, and within a year, it was clear that Russia was becoming Ouagadougou's preferred partner. The turning point was defined by a series of bold decisions. First, the government ended its security cooperation with French forces. Then it began systematically removing French influence, revoking privileges for NGOs, banning French media outlets, and finally, expelling the French ambassador after accusing him of political interference. By the time the last French troops withdrew, it was more than a military disengagement. It was a symbolic eviction, a final and public break from a colonial-era alliance that no longer served Burkina Faso's vision for its future. Once seen as France's firm foothold in West Africa, Burkina Faso has now cast its former colonial partner aside. In its place, Russia has stepped in, and not subtly. The clearest signal of Moscow's rising influence came in late 2023, when it reopened its embassy in Ouagadougou after more than 30 years of silence. This was more than a bureaucratic formality, it was a declaration of intent. Russia was not just visiting, it was settling in. Shortly afterward, Russian military advisors began arriving, but not as part of flashy, uniformed delegations. Instead, they came through discreet cooperation agreements. On the ground, local forces began receiving Russian training, modern equipment, and advisory support. Russian language courses appeared in elite military institutions, embedding cultural ties within Burkina Faso's defense infrastructure. At the same time, in boardrooms and behind closed doors, negotiations were underway. Gazprom, Russia's state-owned energy giant, was securing exploration rights in the oil-rich northern territories. By the time the enormous oil reserve was officially confirmed, Russia had already established a firm grip on both the political and economic apparatus of the state. So, why would President Ibrahim Traore put so much trust in the Kremlin? The answer isn't rooted in shared values or political doctrine. It's grounded in practical necessity. France and other Western powers demanded political reforms, transparent elections, and anti-corruption measures as preconditions for their continued support. Their aid came with fine print. Russia offered something altogether different: non-interference. Sovereignty was respected, regardless of who held power. Where the West saw a military dictatorship, Moscow saw a reliable partner. For Traore, who had seized power in a coup and was still consolidating his rule, this was not just welcome, it was vital. But beyond mutual convenience, there was strategic value. Russia, facing international sanctions and increasing isolation from global energy markets, was seeking new allies and new resource avenues. Partnering with a freshly oil-rich African nation served both an economic and a symbolic purpose. For the Kremlin, this was about more than just barrels of crude. It was a geopolitical statement. Here was a former French colony, not only resisting Western influence, but actively aligning with a sanctioned Eurasian power. The optics were powerful. For Burkina Faso, this alignment wasn't just a diplomatic pivot, it was a lifeline. With France's military presence withdrawn, the country faced intensifying jihadist threats and growing domestic instability. Russia's willingness to provide military aid, without lectures or preconditions, offered President Traore breathing room to stabilize his regime. And perhaps most importantly, the shift in alliances found resonance among ordinary Burkinabe citizens. Many in urban areas had grown weary of France long before the political elite did. For years, France's promises of security and development had been undermined by rising violence and rampant corruption. Many locals saw French interventions as little more than a colonial continuation, masking control behind the guise of partnership. Russia's arrival, in contrast, was portrayed as a clean break from the past. No colonial history, no paternalism, just practical cooperation. When the discovery of 50 billion barrels of oil hit global headlines, it didn't just confirm Burkina Faso's hidden wealth, it reinforced the narrative of a new beginning. This future, as envisioned by the current leadership, is no longer tied to Western capitals. It will be shaped by decisions made in Ouagadougou and Moscow. But the real test lies ahead, not in discovery, but in delivery. With such immense reserves beneath their feet, the question now is how to turn underground potential into above-ground progress. And more critically, who benefits first? Because now, with the groundwork laid, the national vision is coming into focus. Plans are being drafted for expansive infrastructure, networks of highways, energy refineries, and new cities that could emerge from the sands of the Sahel. In many nations, oil is the final goal, the pot of gold, the endgame. But in Burkina Faso, leaders are presenting it differently. This oil find is not being hailed as a miracle windfall, but rather as a starting point, a strategic lever for broader transformation. President Traore's administration isn't branding Burkina Faso as the next petrostate. Instead, they're pitching it as Africa's upcoming transformation hub. The ambition is to use energy not just to power vehicles or boost GDP, but to reimagine the country's identity and role on the continent. And interestingly, the blueprint for this vision isn't being drawn from Paris or even Moscow. Instead, the inspiration seems to come from further east, from the gleaming cities of the United Arab Emirates. If you pay close attention to the rhetoric coming from Burkina Faso's leadership today, you'll hear the echoes of Dubai's Desert to Dynasty story. Bold infrastructure, rapid modernization, and a nation built from the ground up on the back of resource wealth. Once a small, obscure fishing village, Dubai transformed into a global powerhouse of logistics, skyscrapers, trade zones, and tech hubs, all initially fueled by oil. It wasn't oil that sustained its dominance, but it served as the ignition for what came next. That's the inspiration Burkina Faso seems to be following. Rather than allowing oil to become a constraint, the country is positioning it as a springboard. Behind closed doors, the Burkinabe government is drafting extensive, long-term infrastructure blueprints, financed not just by oil revenues, but through partial ownership in the oil operations themselves. Under newly negotiated terms with Gazprom, the Burkinabe state is reportedly acquiring stakes in downstream assets, such as refineries, pipelines, and storage sites. This approach deviates from the usual African model, where countries typically receive royalties while foreign firms dominate the value chain. The goal isn't to merely extract crude and ship it out. Instead, Burkina Faso plans to process the oil domestically, producing refined outputs like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, not just for neighboring nations, but for broader continental export. The Ministry of Energy has already unveiled plans for 3 industrial corridors spanning the country, northward to the Mali border, eastward to Niger, and south toward Ghana. These routes, anchored by new energy hubs, aim to reposition Burkina Faso's landlocked geography into a strategic advantage for regional logistics. It's a bold and ambitious vision, one that many foreign observers greet with skepticism. Turning a conflict-affected, landlocked nation into a regional trade powerhouse isn't merely about having resources. It also requires political stability, strong governance, and time. But for President Traore and his administration, these challenges are seen not as deterrents, but as part of a long-term gamble, with Russia backing the bet. Plans include solar-powered industrial parks to integrate renewable energy alongside oil. Transport infrastructure will serve dual purposes, facilitating trade and deepening regional ties. While critics question the feasibility, Traore and his government remain unfazed. In fact, they're banking on being underestimated. Traore's strategy isn't about utopian dreams. It's a calculated rebellion against conventional development pathways. He has rejected the Western model of development loans and IMF conditions. There will be no more waiting on climate finance handouts or externally dictated reforms. If the West won't collaborate on their terms, Burkina Faso plans to forge its own path, powered by its own resources, efforts, and chosen partners. Importantly, this transformation isn't limited to oil. Over the past year, the country has restructured its mining industry, renegotiated numerous foreign contracts, and launched national enterprises overseeing everything from gold to food logistics. Oil wealth is intended to catalyze a broader diversification plan. This includes establishing a national development bank to support homegrown businesses, a tech startup fund to keep young talent from leaving the country, and the launch of Le Moulin du Sahel, a food processing initiative already exporting local rice to neighboring nations, a quiet but telling step toward economic self-reliance. All of this is being framed as part of what Traore's administration calls a new model of African governance. One where natural wealth doesn't trickle down slowly, but is circulated intentionally and inclusively. Critics argue the agenda is overly ambitious, questioning how a country beset by insurgency and political uncertainty could evolve into an economic beacon in just 10 years. But they may be overlooking a vital shift, a psychological awakening. For the first time in a generation, a Burkinabe leader isn't seeking sympathy or asking for time. He's claiming control. He's not just asking for support. He's asking the people to build, with oil as the down payment. To prevent the pitfalls that plagued other oil-rich African nations, the state is already putting safeguards in place. A digital tracking system is being rolled out to monitor oil revenues in real time. Alongside it, new transparency dashboards are being piloted, designed to let ordinary citizens see where the money goes, who gets infrastructure, how contracts are awarded, and what percentage of the national budget is funded by petroleum profits. If it works, and that's still a big if, Burkina Faso won't just be pumping oil. It'll be pumping legitimacy into public institutions, investment into industries, purpose into a nation long dismissed as expendable by the world's power players. The stakes are enormous. The model is delicate. But for once, the vision is sharp. Burkina Faso doesn't want to be another Nigeria. It wants to become the first Burkina Faso, an original, not a copy. But every bold blueprint comes under fire. And now, with development accelerating, the pressure is mounting, internally and from forces far beyond its borders. Still, nothing seems poised to stop Ibrahim Traore. Not international pressure, not covert threats, not even the quiet murmurs of sabotage whispered in diplomatic backrooms. Because he understands exactly what's at stake: and exactly who's watching. For years, Burkina Faso was treated as a pawn on a chessboard carved by colonial powers. Wealth was extracted, contracts were signed in backrooms, and the people were left with little more than promises and poverty. But this time, the game is changing. Traore isn't just leading a government, he's leading a historical correction. He wants every barrel, every ounce of value, to benefit the people it belongs to. No more intermediaries, no more colonial relics, no more development aid tied to deeper debt. He's building something audacious, a future where Burkinabe citizens own what lies beneath their feet. And no challenge, no foreign media narrative, no diplomatic fallout is going to slow that momentum. Because for Traore, this fight isn't about power anymore. It's about dignity, about destiny, about rewriting the future with Burkinabe hands and Burkinabe will. So the real questions remain. Will Traore back down? How long will it take before Burkina Faso becomes what it dares to envision? Can any outside force stop what's already in motion? Is this the rise of a new African model, or the start of another struggle? Let us know what you think in the comments.